They have like animal allies. Yeah, this is from like 11 to 1.
Okay. So last time we went over our cardiac cycle with its 4 phases. So we are going to be recapping that at the beginning today and then moving into thinking about cardiac output. So part of what we were thinking about, bigger picture of those 4 phases. So we have parts of our cardiac cycle where our heart is contracting, and we have parts of our cardiac cycle where our heart is relaxed. They're not equal in terms of how long they take. So part of what we were doing was thinking about contraction versus relaxation. So when do we have, like, what states does our heart spend more time in? Systole, hopefully you remember, is the contraction part. Diastole is the relaxation part. All right, let's take a look. Okay, good. Yes. So our heart spends more time in diastole. So diastole is that relaxation phase. And it's really important that we spend a lot of time in diastole so that the heart has time to fill and doesn't get too tired, right? So we're going to see that we spend more time in diastole. Getting to those phases, we're going to check in. So we had phases during the 3rd phase of the cardiac cycle. What was the state of our valves? So we know we have atrioventricular valves, AV valves, in both sides of our heart between our atria and our ventricles. We know we have semilunar valves in our great arteries coming out of the heart. In phase 3, what did we have happening? Take another second each to review and getting your answers. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, during phase 3, it's where we have our ventricles contracting and ejecting blood. So yes, during this 3rd phase, our semilunar valves need to be open because this is how we actually get blood into the arteries. Perfect. Okay. So just a reminder of those phases. So when we're looking at our atrial and ventricular pressures and valves, we can link everything all together. So during our 1st phase, we had that filling. During this filling phase, we have our atrial pressure rising a little bit as our blood is slowly filling the atria. We're particularly interested in blood in the right atrium because that is where all our veins come back to with their deoxygenated blood first. Okay. Our ventricular pressure is low at this point because we've just emptied it out, basically. So our atrial pressure is this pink line. The green line is the ventricular pressure. Okay, so the atrial pressure is slowly rising. Ventricular pressure is low. At the end of this first phase, our atria contract, squeezing their blood into the ventricles, okay, which rises the pressure of the ventricle a little bit. And then as we cross into phase 2, our ventricles start to squeeze, right? So during the second phase, our isovolumetric contraction phase, we have a sharp rise in ventricular pressure because we don't have any blood escaping. All our valves are basically closed at this point, kind of transitioning. No blood's coming in or out though, so we're just rising that pressure, shooting it up, okay? At the same time, the atrial pressure is falling a little bit. That's why it's important that those AV valves are closed because we're preventing that kind of backwash of blood into the atria. During phase 3, our ventricular pressure rises at the first part as our ventricles continue squeezing, but by the end of it, that ventricular pressure is falling because we're actively squeezing out the blood and there's kind of nothing left. And then we start to relax in our fourth phase. That relaxation is isovolumetric again until we cycle back to our first phase. So these pressures have to do with whether we have blood moving, right? So if we have an increase in blood volume, that creates an increase in pressure because there's more stuff. So think about it like making a crowded room more crowded, that's more pressure. The other way we can create more pressure is when we squeeze something, right? You're in a crowded room and suddenly the walls start closing in, you're going to feel some pressure. So does your blood in your heart, okay? Ways we can reduce pressure, basically, if we relax, make that room bigger, give ourselves more space, more relaxed. Or if we physically start pushing blood out, that room's emptying as everyone's leaving, that also creates less pressure. So we have these two things kind of going on at once in our cardiac cycle. Now, we've been focusing on the heart thus far, but we want to also know what's going on in the aorta, which is the big blood vessel leaving your left ventricle, going out to your systemic circuit. And the aorta is really important because it's going to keep blood consistently flowing in a steady stream to all the organs in your body. So what happens in the aorta is kind of critical. Okay. So in terms of what's going on in aortic pressure relative to our cardiac cycle, during diastole, that relaxation phase, so we see diastole at the beginning and end here, right? So we're starting in mid to late diastole with our cardiac cycle, okay? And then we're in diastole kind of here as well, right? So, oops, sorry, obviously there as well. It's kind of whole period. Okay, so during diastole, our aortic valve closes. So the aortic valve is a semilunar valve, right? Semilunar, okay? So during the diastolic phase, right, while your heart is relaxing, you don't want blood to come from the aorta and go back into the heart. So if it tries to do that, those semilunar valves catch the blood, which is what pumps them open, okay? That makes it so that that high pressure in the aorta doesn't drive blood into a ventricle with falling pressure, okay? And the reason we actually care about this, or maybe vice versa, the reason we measure this, right? Our lowest point of pressure in the aorta during diastole, okay? That's your diastolic pressure. Okay. And what we measure when we measure blood pressure, those two numbers, right? If your blood pressure is like 120/80, or like, I guess let's read off of this graph, like 110/70. What those numbers mean is those are a comparison of the pressure in your arteries during systole, that stress part when the heart is squeezing out, versus the pressure in your blood vessels during diastole, so that relaxed phase when the heart is filling with blood. So those blood pressure metrics are really metrics about how is your heart squeezing blood? How are your arteries reacting to that? So that's what's up with those two numbers. Okay. So the lowest pressure in the aorta during diastole, that relaxation phase, creates the lower number, the diastolic pressure. Okay. And our highest point, that systolic pressure, that upper one, is going to be happening when your heart is squeezing. Okay. So your heart is squeezing. That aorta is filling with blood because we have a ventricular ejection phase. It's ejecting blood into the aorta. So the aortic valve opens because for that direction of flow, those cusps just collapse into the walls of the aorta. The aorta swells with blood. Pressure in the aorta rises because now there's more blood here, creating our highest pressure, that systolic pressure. There is a slight little notch happening here at the beginning of this phase here, as there's backflow of blood right here in this kind of transition point. But we're not going to really worry about that. What we really want to understand is systolic pressure is that highest pressure during contraction, diastolic pressure is that lowest blood pressure during relaxation. And we'll talk a lot in A&P2 about our mean arterial pressure, MAP, here in the center. So just note here, it's between your diastolic and systolic pressure, and it's an average, but it's closer to that diastolic pressure because, as we just said at the beginning of class in that first question, our heart spends more time in diastole. So we have to weight the average when we talk about average blood pressures. Okay. So mean arterial pressure, or MAP, is our average aortic pressure during the cardiac cycle. And this is our force that pushes blood through our systemic circuit out to all of our organs, right? The pressure in the aorta is what's driving the pressure out to your organs, the flow to all of those organs. You want continuous blood flow going to your organs. So continuous blood flow during the cardiac cycle, because you don't want your organs getting just like pulses of blood. They want a steady-ish stream, okay? So your blood pressure and the pressure in the aorta is really important for that, because even while your heart is relaxing and filling with blood, your aorta is holding some pressure that it can release to continue flow to your organs. So basically, we think of the aorta and other large arteries as well as a pressure reservoir. So they have these elastic walls, right? So think of them kind of like a rubber band, or we can again kind of think about a balloon, right? Like they stretch out when there's high pressure coming into them. And then when there's low pressure around them, no more blood coming in, right? The walls are stretchy and they kind of collapse back down, right? Causing that blood to continue squeezing out. They've like stored the pressure in those elastic walls, okay? So this is why we can have a continuous flow of blood to the organs, is because we swell those walls every time our heart beats, pushes blood into it. And then as our heart is filling and relaxing, that aorta is bouncing back, continuing to push the blood along. So the way that works is kind of like this. Okay, so during systole, we have our blood flow during that ventricular ejection coming from that left ventricle, going through our aortic semilunar valve, coming into the aorta. And this swells the walls of the aorta out, okay? So we got a lot of volume, a lot of pressure here during that ventricular ejection phase. So the walls are bulging out because of that increase in volume and pressure. Some of that blood is still going through to the systemic organs, of course. Both of these things are happening at once. During diastole, while the heart is resting and relaxing and refilling with blood, we don't want blood to go back, right? So those aortic valves, those semilunar valves are now closed, right? So we have no backflow of blood because of the closure of the aortic valves. What's happening now is that we have this elastic recoil. So that bulge is flattening back out, okay? And as we pull those walls back in, we maintain that flow out to the organs. Okay, so as these walls are collapsing in, the extra blood, that extra blood and extra pressure is now moving forward, continuing into our systemic circuit. Okay. So when we are thinking about how much blood is in your circulatory system, how much blood is getting to your organs, we may want to think about how much blood is in the ventricles during certain parts of our cardiac cycle. Okay. So we have a couple terms to define here. So the first one, our end diastolic volume, happens, as it says, at the end of diastole. So the end of diastole, diastole is our relaxation phase, right? So our relaxation phase, heart filling with blood, swelling with blood, regaining the blood, right? So this is when we're going to have essentially the most volume of blood available in our ventricle, right? So in diastole, the right atrium has filled with its deoxygenated blood from the veins. That started to dribble in the ventricles, the end of diastole, because that rest period, we're thinking from the perspective of a ventricle, those atria have even contracted and pushed their blood into the ventricle, right? So this is the most blood we can have in a ventricle. Opposite is going to be at the end of systole. So this is at the end of our squeezing phase, systole, squeezing, contracting. Okay, so our end systolic volume, okay, happens at the end of systole after we have squeezed out as much blood as we can. So at the end of that ventricular ejection phase, right? This is the least blood we'll have in our heart, okay? Now, the reason we care about these two things is we care how much blood got out to our body, right? Like we care how much blood our organs got. Okay. So if we have the most blood at the end of diastole, the end of that filling, at the end of that relaxation, and then we have the least blood after we squeeze blood out, okay? The blood that we lost, that difference went out to our body, right? So that went out to all your organs, into your brain, into your liver, into your muscles, okay? So that blood that we lost, that we sent out to our organs, that's your stroke volume. Okay? So stroke volume is the volume of blood that got ejected during that ventricular ejection phase. So to find the stroke volume, we can just compare how much blood did we start with at the end of diastole? How much blood did we end up with at the end of systole after we squeezed out as much as we can? Okay, so to calculate our stroke volume, we subtract, starting with our end diastolic volume, and then subtract out that systolic volume. So we just subtracted our least from our most, right? So most blood minus the least blood, and diastolic volume minus systolic volume gives us the amount we lost. And here, lost is kind of good because it went to our organs. So that is how we calculate stroke volume. Now, we can also compare kind of how effective this was, because we said that the heart is the size of a fist, right? But my fist and your fist aren't necessarily the same size. Not every person is the same size. Not every heart is the same size. So sometimes we're going to want to be able to kind of like calibrate that, right? In terms of if we just compare a number of milliliters between a really small person and a really big person, well, their organs are also smaller, right? So it would mean something different. So to calibrate that, we'll often calculate our ejection fraction. Okay. Now our ejection fraction is basically giving us kind of a percent. So we're going to take that stroke volume, right? So that was our end diastolic volume, the most blood we had in our heart, minus our end systolic volume, which was the least blood after we squeeze. All right, so that gives us a number basically in milliliters because we're just calculating how much volume we squeeze out of the heart. So to turn that into a percent, we're just going to divide it by that bigger number, that most number, right? So the amount we lost over the most blood that we had in there at any point. So we're dividing by that end diastolic volume. And that gives us our ejection fraction. Our ejection fraction is then kind of calibrated basically to your body size or the size of your heart, right? So we could compare like 54% between a small person and a large person, right? That would make more sense than comparing just number of milliliters. And I'll put up some practice problems about this for you. Okay. So looking here at that volume of blood, right, we can see how we created that end diastolic volume. Okay, so the ventricle is relaxed during that first phase, the ventricular filling, right? Ventricles filling. We have a plateau during that isovolumetric contraction because we didn't change the volume in the ventricle, right? So the ventricle would still be with that same end diastolic volume, both at the end of phase 1 and during phase 2. Then we squeeze out blood during our ventricular ejection phase, okay, giving us our end systolic volume. Then we have a plateau because now we have our isovolumetric relaxation, okay? So still at end systolic volume. And that amount we lost in between these two was squeezed out into the aorta. That's your stroke volume. So again, we got our big picture with everything linked together. Okay, so we've talked about the phases and where the blood is going. We talked a bit about the pressures, comparing them. Right? We talked about the state of the valves, which direct blood flow. Now we've talked about the volume of blood. Okay, we talked about our EKGs. We talked about those electrical pulses. So we're going to take a look as well at our heart sounds in a second. Okay. But before we do that, I just want to note, we do have a kind of cyclical relationship between volume and pressure in the heart, okay? So if we're looking at the volume of the left ventricle, because that's really the perspective we're taking when we're thinking about our cardiac cycle, we can see that during phase 1, our blood volume increases in the ventricle, right? We're filling with blood. As we fill up that room with more blood, right, we see a little bit of an increase in pressure, okay, because there's more stuff in it. When we really see the increase in pressure, though, is during phase 2 and even the beginning of phase 3, when that ventricle starts to squeeze. So this phase 2 is that isovolumetric contraction, right? So that straight up part, okay? No changes in volume. That's why it's straight up. All we have changing is pressure. That pressure is changing dramatically, though. During phase 3, ventricular ejection, we're still squeezing, right? So the pressure is still rising, okay? But then it starts to drop, and it drops pretty fast as we are losing blood from the heart. Our stroke volume, that amount of blood leaving the heart during this phase. Okay. And then during phase 4, that isovolumetric relaxation, we go straight down, back to the beginning, as the heart fully relaxes and is then able to fill with blood. All right. So the heart sounds have to do what's going on with our heart, and specifically what's kind of going on with our valves. Okay. So it's not actively the sound of the valve. You're not hearing the valve slammed shut. What you're hearing is the blood going as it hits a closing valve. You're hearing like turbulent flow. So the first heart sound that you hear, the soft lub of the lub dub, are the AV valves closing and the turbulent flow of that blood hitting them as it tries to move backwards but can't. Okay, so this is happening first. So this is causing that increased pressure in the ventricle during isovolumetric contraction, is causing some backshift of blood towards the atria. It can't get there, pushes those AV valves into that closed position, and you hear that sound softly at first. The second heart sound you hear is from the semilunar valves, okay? So this is as the heart is relaxing, its pressure falls in the ventricles. We have higher pressure in the arteries at that point because we just squeeze blood into them. So that blood tries to move back into the heart, but the semilunar valves open, so it can't. And we hear that back shift of blood as well. So this means that when we listen to those heart sounds, we can diagnose valve problems if those sounds sound fun, right? If they last for the wrong amount of time or they're happening at the wrong time. This means that we have some issue with a valve, either in the heart, if we're thinking about that first sound, or those semilunar valves out in really the aorta, often, if we're thinking about that second sound. Okay. So we can see how those map on to our cardiac cycle. Okay. So that first heart sound, okay, is happening right here during that isovolumetric contraction. So that's the lub dub, the lub part of the lub dub, right? That soft sound. Those are our AV valves. Okay. And then during that isovolumetric relaxation, as we're going into diastole, we have those semilunar valves closing, so the ones in the arteries, creating the second sound. Okay. And take a listen to the difference between those two types of sound. Okay. So this is a normal heart, a healthy heart. So you hear the slightly fainter one and then the slightly louder one, the lub dub is what we're listening for. Next, we're going to listen to an unhealthy heart. So this is a heart with aortic stenosis. So you hear how we don't have those same two pulses, right? We don't hear the sound of one valve closing and then the other set of valves closing. Instead, we hear that first beat decently well, and then we've got kind of like a blur, right? So aortic stenosis is something, stenosis means like turning to stone, kind of. So this is our valves getting kind of like crunchy and the aorta getting kind of crunchy, right? So we're having blood flow that's kind of remaining turbulent kind of throughout a little bit because these valves aren't closing and opening appropriately at the right times. And we can literally hear that just by listening to the heart. All right, so again, our normal heart. All right, and here we have the aortic stenosis. And these are not the only, this isn't the only valvular condition that you could diagnose by listening to a heart sound. You can find out all sorts of different problems with blood flow in the heart just by listening to the sounds. So now we're going to move forward and think about cardiac output. Okay. So when we're thinking about cardiac output, it really is just how much blood we're losing from the heart. Oh, I should have made this clickable, sorry. Okay. But we're gonna link this up to something we talked about in our last unit. Okay, so we were thinking about our nervous system last time, right? So now we want to know how we can affect what the heart is doing as we start to think about, okay, how can we control when the heart outputs more blood versus less? So one of the things we want to remember is that our heart, that cardiac muscle, is an effector organ for our autonomic nervous system. So we have our fight or flight, sympathetic part of the nervous system, fight or flight. We have our rest and digest part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. They're both autonomics. They're happening automatically. Okay. And they are going to control how fast our heart beats. I'll tell you right now, hopefully predictable just from these little abbreviations, right? That fight or flight, sympathetic part of our nervous system, it's going to speed the heart up. That rest and digest, parasympathetic part of the nervous system, it's going to slow our heart down, right? So when we're fighting or fleeing, we need a fast heart. We need lots of blood going out to our organs to supply those muscles with oxygen. When you're resting, digesting, sleeping, you can have a nice, slow, relaxed heart, not overwork that heart muscle. The somatic nervous system, remember, is specifically for skeletal muscle. So only muscle connected to bones. So when we are thinking about cardiac output, this is referring to the amount of blood that we're pumping out to the body from the ventricles per minute. So this isn't per heartbeat, this is per minute. So we got a unit of time here. So we just saw that our stroke volume is how much blood we ejected during the cardiac cycle, right? So we saw that that was our end diastolic volume minus our end systolic volume. So just the amount of blood that escaped during each heartbeat. But since cardiac output is over time, right, per minute, we got to get from heartbeat by heartbeat to a minute. So we're going to multiply it by our heart rate, which is our number of beats per minute, right? So this is the volume per beat. Right? And to get an amount per minute, I guess volume per beat, right? This is our beats per minute. So this is going to give us the total output of the heart over a minute. And the reason we care about it over a length of time rather than just with one individual heartbeat, right, is because we can speed our heart up or slow it down, right? So we want to be able to measure that. We care about that. That means something for our organs. Okay. So that's why we got to have the heart rate in there instead of just caring about each heartbeat. On average, you're moving about 5 liters of blood per minute at rest. So your average cardiac output is usually around 5. Your average blood volume in your body is about 5.5 liters of blood. So most of it, you're moving most of it around in a minute. Okay. So we can change the cardiac output by changing either of those numbers. Okay. Right. So our cardiac output equation, put it back up, cardiac output is our stroke volume. So that volume per minute by our heart rate, which was the beats per minute. Okay. So if we want to change the amount of blood that our body gets in a minute, that cardiac output, we can change either stroke volume or heart rate. Right. So for a second, I'm going to predict how could you increase the amount of blood your organs are getting every minute? How could you do that? Be on the next slides, but hopefully this is kind of intuitive, right? If you want to increase the cardiac output, right, you want more blood going to your organs per minute, you can either make the stroke volume go up, or you can make the heart rate go up, or both, right? So if you want more blood to get to your organs, right, just multiply a bigger number in that equation somewhere, okay? This is what we're doing when we regulate cardiac output, is we're just playing with, okay, how much blood are we squeezing out each heartbeat? So the stroke volume part. And then how many heartbeats do we have in a minute? That heart rate part, okay? And we do that with our nervous system, with those autonomic nerves. And we have a little bit of auto-regulation in the heart as well. So there are some things that the heart kind of changes that also affect this. Okay. So a reminder about our sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Okay. So our parasympathetic nerves are craniosacral in origin. What we care about right now is the cranial part. So here we have our vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, carries parasympathetic innervation. Okay. And specifically, can carry parasympathetic innervation to our pacemaker cells. So to the SA node, the main one, and also to the AV node, okay? So parasympathetics are going to those pacemaker cells. This is why they can affect the speed of the heart. Our sympathetic nerves are thoracolumbar in origin, so they're coming out of those T1 through L2 vertebrae, okay? And they go to those same places, right? So we can see exactly the same relationship to that SA node and the AV node, right? So they can also change your heart rate. But the sympathetic nervous system can do a neat extra trick. The sympathetic nerves are also connected to the heart muscle itself, right? So you can see this connection to the ventricular myocardium, okay? Which means that your sympathetic nervous system is not only going to be able to change how fast your heart beats, so it can affect not only the heart rate, but also that stroke volume, because it's going to be able to affect how hard your heart clutches, basically, the effectiveness of that contraction. Okay, so your heart rate overall is determined by that sinoatrial node in the right atrium. We know that that's the fastest of our nodes. It's a pacemaker. Its intrinsic firing rate is actually 100 beats per minute, which is faster than a typical heart rate. Okay? So if you had no nerves going to your heart at all, you'd probably be dead, but also your heart rate would be 100 beats per minute. Now, this is not the case if you're just sitting down. Probably this is not your heart rate at the moment, although mine is 110 right now, so I have a little fear of public speaking, actually. Anyway, so 100 beats per minute is the baseline for the SA node, okay? But because we have control of that SA node with our parasympathetic and sympathetic parts of our nervous system, when we're at rest, that parasympathetic nervous system is dominating, sending action potentials to your heart, telling it to relax a little bit, keeping your heart rate down around 75, maybe lower, depending how at rest you are. If you're excited or you're stressed out or drank a lot of coffee, right? That sympathetic nervous system takes over and this increases your heart rate, can go way above 100 beats per minute. Now, the way that this works does have to do with our receptors, okay? So remember, we have sympathetic nerves that release norepinephrine, epinephrine coming from the adrenal medulla, linked up with that sympathetic activity hormone that often acts the same. Both of these can bind to adrenergic receptors. Specifically, what we have in the SA node are beta-1 receptors. Okay? Those beta-1 receptors, what they do at the SA node is they open up sodium channels and calcium channels. We know both sodium and calcium like to rush into cells, right? So this is causing depolarization, okay? So we're increasing the rate at which that SA node depolarizes, speeding up the heart rate. More action potentials, more heartbeats, greater heart rate. Okay. So the overall effect here, we'll save the math and do a bunch of practice problems on Wednesday so that we can get through as much content as possible today. Okay. So what's happening here? We have our sympathetic nervous system increasing our heart rate, right? We would see an increase in cardiac output, okay? Or if we had our parasympathetic nervous system working, so the reverse, right? If we're at rest, our parasympathetic nervous system depressing the heart rate, that would decrease our cardiac output. Okay? And it's really these kind of simple relationships that we're interested in. We're thinking about increases and decreases for now. So our practice problems will be like for practicing understanding these relationships rather than as a math. We do the calculation. We will practice these on Wednesday. Here's a picture of what's going on here. You don't need to memorize this picture, but this is just showing you that relationship between our norepinephrine and epinephrine, our beta-1 receptor, which we remember activates cyclic AMP. And this is opening channels for sodium and calcium, causing depolarization and faster action potentials. So the reverse happens with our parasympathetics. When we have increases in parasympathetic activity, specifically, this is the vagus nerves. That's it. That's our only nerve that is controlling our heart rate from our parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. Cranial nerve time. Parasympathetic activity coming from that vagus nerve. We also have cholinergic receptors in the sinoatrial node. Acetylcholine is what comes out of those postganglionic nerves from our parasympathetic nervous system, including from the vagus nerve. Specifically, they're muscarinic cholinergic receptors so that they can do more complicated things than our other type of cholinergic receptor. What they do is they open up potassium channels and they close calcium channels here. Opening a potassium channel means potassium is going to leave your cell. Closing those calcium channels means we're blocking calcium from coming in. And so the overall effect is that it's harder to depolarize the cell, right? If you've got positive charges leaving and you're kind of blocking some positive charges from entering, you decrease that rate of depolarization and you even kind of hyperpolarize the cells. So this is how we slow down those action potentials and decrease the heart rate. And this is a picture of that. Okay. So if we compare what heart rates look like under each of these conditions. So in gray, we have our rest, okay? So here we can see heart rate 0.8 seconds between our beats. If our sympathetic nervous system is active, right? Now we have 1, 2, 3 heartbeats. If our parasympathetic nervous system is dominating, we just had 1 heartbeat in the same graph worth of time, okay? So we see just changes to the frequency of those action potentials. So we can recognize here that that's our action potential from our pacemaker cells. other way we can extrinsically change our heart rate is with epinephrine, which is a hormone. Works pretty much exactly as our sympathetic nervous system does. It's the same type of pathway, can bind to the same receptors, although they have different preferences. So this also increases the action potential happening at the SA node. This also increases the action potential in the muscle fibers. Weird thing is that glucagon can also increase heart rate. So glucagon was our hormone of our post-absorptive state, right? So the post-absorptive state is when you're not eating, you're not digesting, right? So it's more associated with these periods of time when we have our sympathetic nervous system more likely to be active. We have less parasympathetic activity because the parasympathetics are for resting and digesting. So glucagon actually affects the heart rate as well. It's just a sort of side job of glucagon. Okay. So in summary, the ways that we can affect our heart rate, right? These are just the same thing that we just talked through on each of the slides, right? Sympathetic neurons go to the SA node and they raise the heart rate. Parasympathetic neurons go to the SA node also, but they lower the heart rate. The other important part, I would consider glucagon not really important for our purposes here. We cared about it when we cared about blood sugar. We're not going to care about it when we care about the heart. But epinephrine we do care about, right? That stress hormone coming from our adrenal medulla. This can raise our heart rate, just like our sympathetic nervous system did. Okay. So we will pause here for today. Okay, and next time we'll do a bunch of practice problems and make sure that we know a little bit about how we can regulate that other bit, the stroke volume. There's really just one thing we're going to think about there, pretty much.